we have here with us Clarissa Smith from Northumbria University, who is going to give us a webinar about British sexual cultures. So the floor is yours, Clarissa. Thanks so much.
Thank you. Thanks for inviting me, and thanks to everybody for turning up today, and anybody who happens to watch the video afterwards as well. Really pleased to be virtually in Spain, if not there in actual presence. So what I'm going to do today is of course necessarily a kind of quite a truncated history or in fact survey of issues to do with British sexual cultures. I think it's important to recognise that even as we might identify something that could be understood to be the British sexual personality, I'm not entirely convinced that we can state with any absolute certainty what it means to be sexual in Britain. There isn't just one form of sexual culture. But I do think it's important to recognise how sex might be closely tied to ideas of community and questions of national identity. And what you've got here is a quote from one-time producer of British sex films, a guy called Stanley Long, who summed up the British and sex in this way, that until the 1960s, there had been such a suppression of all things sexual. I think it was a hangover from the Victorian era, and this country suffered from terrible inhibitions. I think it's a national trait that we aren't very good at being erotic. The Italians pinch bums, the French have mistresses, and we're not very good at either. And so that leads to all kinds of, joke or, comedy kinds of sketches, such as this idea of proper British sex, which is basically that a man doffs his cap to a woman as he walks by her. This is the kind of Victorian era. And then in the 1970s, an incredibly popular play first of all, and then film, No Sex, Please, We're British, which has been one of the ways that really Brits are kind of understood around the world as really not very good at sex or too prudish for sex. And this is not it's not just the British who are ascribed these kinds of stereotypes. There are references to French kissing and the abilities of French lovers, but also Italian Latin lovers and their flirtatious interactions with women constantly, German efficiencies and kinkiness, Scandinavian free love, and of course there's also the idea that the English are particularly partial to corporal punishment, and these surface constantly in popular culture, and they may well be outmoded stereotypes rather than evidence of national preferences, but they are something that circulates both at home and abroad in ways that mean that they have impacts on our understanding of sex and sexual cultures and sexual identities. So I think it is important to recognise that there are these aspects really to popular culture and popular life. And actually, if you were to examine the popular press running from the turn of the Victorian era right up to the present day, you'd actually think that the British are pretty obsessed with sex, that we're certainly obsessed with forms of increased visibility and the seemingly diverse nature of media representations of sex and sexuality. And it might, on one hand, suggest that British society has become increasingly liberal and tolerant of expressions of different sexual interests. But I am not entirely convinced by that, in that I think that we have a really double-edged way of thinking about ourselves as sexual and as a culture, what kind of sex we're prepared to accept as reasonable. And of course, all of this fits really with the idea of sexuality as a cultural production, right? It is as a cultural production, as Harperin suggests, it represents the appropriation of the human body and its physiological capacities by an ideological discourse. Sexuality is not a somatic fact, it is a cultural effect. And one of the things that seems to be particularly important about thinking about British sexual cultures is the kind of idea around the sex scandal and the ways in which we seem to be absolutely focused on ideas of what is good and what is bad sex, what is appropriate behaviour and what isn't. And this really feeds in, I think, to the idea of the ways in which the British are characterised at home and abroad as rather sexually inept, that we're in possession of a rather obsessive and puerile sexual humour, and also a lack of sophistication in our pursuit of the passions. So, you know, some of the headlines here says it's Paddy Pants Down and teacher romp with teen boy. Is they constantly are references really to a kind of slightly seedy but also silly kind of obsessive view of sex. And also we have this general reputation for being rather stoic, or our British stiff upper lip, so that we're also characterised as rather reserved, if not straightforwardly puritanical. And so that all feeds into the ways in which we seem to be outraged by sexual scandal, but also really delight in being outraged. So histories of British sexual cultures often start in the 1960s, and the space in which the sexual revolution began but did not actually fully end in Britain until probably the next decade. But I think that the 1980s is more influential on the current moment and on the kind of current mores that we have. And in an hour, I can't go into the full nuances of British sexual culture. So I hope, you know, that what you see here is a kind of snapshot. There are other stories that we could tell as well, but I don't have time to do that. So I want to look a little bit at the kind of the 1980s and its sorts of sexual interests. And here we have Linda Lusardi, who was one of the first page 3 girls, one of the first really celebrated page 3 girls of the 1980s. And the page 3 was a feature of a national newspaper, The Sun, still in existence, still mixing up sex and news stories. And Lusardi was one of a number of young women who graced the pages of The Sun and made the page 3 into something of an institution. It has now disappeared, but it's taken, well, it took nearly 30 years for it to lose its sparkle as a thing. Basically, page 3 was a picture of a young woman, topless or nearly topless, smiling and sometimes referring to current news stories in a way that was highlighted the kind of fun of this newspaper. And this is another Sun page 3 girl. This is Sam Fox, who aged 16 as her birthday arrived She appeared in The Sun topless on page 3, and this is her holding the edition of The Sun in which she appeared, and this is her on her 16th birthday. There was, in fact, a countdown to the day that she could appear in The Sun. So a really, the idea of sexualizing a 16-year-old that we might find quite uncomfortable now, but at the time, in the 1980s, seemed absolutely appropriate. And this is Rolling Stones bass player Bill Wyman with his girlfriend at the time, but became his wife. This is Mandy Smith. Their relationship started when she was 13, and yet there seemed to be very little condemnation of that, simply a kind of sense that, oh, hasn't he done well for himself? So there's something really interesting, I think, though I'm not going to go into it in great detail, but something very interesting about the idea of youth and sexuality in British popular culture in the 1980s. Princess Diana was introduced as Charlie's Girl, and with this infamous photograph in which, she was positioned by photographers so that her skirt became see-through, and a kind of playing games with the idea of sex constantly, even in a story which apparently has real significance for our idea of ourselves as a nation state. But also scandal, of course, was a part of the deal. And this is the scandal with Lord Archer, Geoffrey Archer, who is perhaps still best known for his sort of racy novels, pretty rubbishy novels, who lied and lied again in court about his payments to a sex worker in order to, avoid a scandal. But in the judge's summing up of the court case, it was Archer's wife and her difference from the vice girl that made very clear that the world is divided according to sets of rules around sex that revolve very much still around ideas of class and appropriate forms of femininity. So his wife was described by the judge as, is she not fragrant? Is she not perfect? And of course, the vice girl being understood as very different. And then, of course, we have the utterly abominable, well, I don't know, take your pick. Two of them are utterly abominable, I think. But Jimmy Savile and Margaret Thatcher, the paedophile, the serial paedophile hiding in plain sight and lauded everywhere by politicians and royalty alike. So The Sun, I think, is important to any story about British sexual cultures because its combination of booze, birds and the box. This is the idea that one of its editors had, that the focus should be in the newspaper on booze, birds and the box, i.e. a very masculine kind of idea of having good fun, watching telly and all the rest of it. And this brings a particularly working class hedonism to the newsstands. And for that, sex, of course, was used as an important element in marketing the paper right from the start. And The Sun dispensed with coy excuses for sexually explicit feature articles. It thought that its readers were absolutely interested in, for example, Princess Diana's legs, or Diana Spencer as she was then, her legs. But actually, it wasn't just aimed at men either. It also spoke very directly to women. And there was a real sense that this was a newspaper that could be read by all the family. So there's an interesting element of idea of family here in terms of sex here. And with its very simple, direct and memorable language, The Sun certainly plays a game around the cultural position of its readers and the importance of sex to them. The Sun wasn't just a news gatherer or a mediator, but it also positioned itself as a newsmaker itself, a kind of agent through which ordinary people's voices are expressed. An outcry at The Sun's overtly sexual character offered another kind of indication that the newspaper was iconoclastic, feeding into its complex personality as enabling enjoyment of fun and sensuality. And, you know, that actually readers really were the same as, for example, Charlie, right? This is Prince Charles. Here you get a picture of his girlfriend, Charlie's girl, like he was our mate down the street. This has really, you know, significant political implications for us, actually, and maybe the reason that we still have, we're still ruled by a group of people that may not have our best interests at heart, as I will come to later in the lecture. But actually, The Sun wasn't just all about fun, right? It also focused on ideas of evil, particularly here the seeming evil of twisted male teachers and their sordid sex with pupils, or politicians exceeding their what might be considered to be good fun and engaging in forms of sex that really transgressed a particular boundary that The Sun drew. And it was really quite tight, this boundary of what was okay and not okay. So, you know, one of the other things that kind of is a particular element of British cultural life and around sexuality is the idea that legislation is always our first recourse when there's something that we don't like. And so particularly when it comes to sex, there are issues that we don't particularly like. And certainly legislation has ramped up in recent years. So what I've got here are some examples from the past in the, I hope it's your top right-hand corner, 1950s saucy postcards. One of the things that at some point has almost been an emblem of British sexual cultures was also the subject of police raids, seizures and prosecutions. But at the same time, forms of legislation were brought in to ensure that actually, you know, our culture was not becoming too obscene, right? So so the passing of laws such as the Obscene Publications Act of 1959, which was an updating of a Victorian era legislation, which caught the D.H. Lawrence novel Lady Chatterley's Lover in 1960, but then has been added to with various Child Protection Acts, as well as the 1984 Video Recordings Act, which saw all video films subject to the classification procedures of the British Board of Film Certification, with an 18R certificate being given for depictions of sex that could only be sold in sex shops. But what's really interesting, I think, about, you know, legislation is something that all jurisdictions seem to want to have. But one of the things that I think is interesting to note about the ways in which the British go forward with legislation is that there's a real ramping up of the idea of the horrors that sexual content coming into the home or horror content coming into the home will enact on families and on individuals. And so, you know, headlines about the dangers of porn in the front room, it's a poison being peddled as home entertainment, and a real belief in the idea that terrible impacts can be felt on people by the presence of pornography or sexual content. And you know, I've got this headline here, which is about the Video Nasties campaign, and it's actually a line from a policeman in Margate who said that the maniac who was attacking horses in 1984 could have been affected by video nasties or a new moon. And so, you know, that kind of doubling off of the idea that media forms have really terrible impacts on individuals, almost like a form of witchcraft or, you know, belief in the supernatural. So we have gone, you know, quite full on in terms of legislation. We have tried to indicate what might be obscene, what's likely to deprave and corrupt people, and what kinds of sexual representations we're willing to view. And these were very much based on ideas of morality, which of course during the 60s and 70s were changing quite exponentially, and due to the sexual revolution. I say exponentially, they felt like they were changing exponentially, but of course there's always a kind of pullback and an attempt to make sure that we don't go too far, as some campaigners would say. And so in the 1980s, actually, we see a renewed resurgence of arguments against sexual culture, commercial sex particularly, in the form of videos, sex shops, strippers. You can see here one of the leading lights of the anti-sex campaigns. Her name was Mary Whitehouse. And she became a byword for a particular kind of prudish irritation around representations of sexuality. And she's pictured here with two members of the male strip club or male strip show, the London Boys. But one of the things that was particularly successful about her campaigning was the ways in which she focused less on the kind of public morals rationale which had characterized previous decades, and much more in terms of the highly emotive protection of children approach, and abandoning the attempt to utilize the 1959 Obscene Publications Act in favor of trying to gain alternative forms of legislation which would outlaw material without the necessity to go to court. And so, and they were successful. You know, there were various kinds of legislation passed. The Indecent Displays Control Act of 1981, which curtailed sexual advertisements, the Cinematographic Acts of 1982 and 1985, which eliminated sex cinemas, the Video Recordings Act, as I've said already, of 1984, which reintroduced the concept of pre-censorship into Britain, and then also the Local Government Miscellaneous Provisions Act of 1982, which closed hundreds of sex shops and ensured that newsagents became the main suppliers of very soft-core kinds of pornography. There are a range of other, I think I can't really talk about legislation without mentioning that there are other acts as well. So Protection of Children Act 1978, and these are all, the rest of these also have elements in them that prohibit child representations of child sexuality, not just child porn, but also images that might be understood to be sexual of young people under 18. So, you know, the kind of Puritan approach actually was pretty successful for a long time. And one of the things that has happened actually in the UK has been what Linda Williams has suggested is a recategorization of obscenity. Actually, not so much the recategorization, but actually it's remaking as forms of perversity, and in the UK particularly ideas of extremity. And so we've moved away really from the notion of explicit sex and towards the targeting of scapegoatable deviants, I think. And this kind of division of good and bad sex has become very cemented, I think, in the UK. And this was seen particularly in the passing of the Criminal Justice and Immigration Act of 2008. I'm not going to go into the details of that, but this is a law that effectively prohibits possession of anything that can be deemed to be extreme. And to be deemed extreme, it needs to appear to be realistic. And depicting, for example, kidnap and rape in a sexualized manner. I can't go into the detail of why this is a really problematic piece of legislation, because it, you know, we need to be talking about forms of representation, what is realistic, what isn't realistic. So I'm going to leave detailing those problems, but I want to highlight the fact that actually it outlaws representations of acts that are legal to perform or to engage in or to indulge in. But once you photograph them, then they become an extreme image and therefore illegal to have. So, nipple piercing, for example, carried out as part of a BDSM scene would be considered as an injury and therefore would be criminalized if it was created as an image. So there are real problems with this particular law, and it kind of joins with other legal actions that have happened in recent years, which appear really to be blatant attempts to clamp down on the BDSM community, in spite of very bland assurances that are given by politicians, by the police, by the CPS, that the proposals will not be intended to target anyone in particular. The actual bill dropped that pretense and made it illegal in and of itself to engage in activities which might result in forms of injury or modification to the body. And certainly it is difficult, I think, to look at some of the prosecutions that have happened in the UK in recent years and not think that actually there is a targeting of different groups, of minority sexual groups. This is Michael Peacock here, who was prosecuted under the Obscene Publications Act for distribution of hardcore gay videos in 2012. And certainly there was an attempt in the court, in the prosecution case, to indicate that gay sex sits quite uneasily on the boundary between bad sex and good sex. And although the case was won, you know, that hasn't, although Nikki Hodgson here suggests that today is a great day for English sexual liberties, I'm not entirely convinced that we've seen many prosecutions that have come about under the Criminal Justice Act of 2008 have targeted gay representations. And we are seeing increasing calls for legislation as we move forward to the Audiovisual Media Services Regulations of 2014 was intended to offer a list of prescribed activities for videoing or film for viewing. Actually, most of the prescribed activities were ones that women might well enjoy, or that had particular significance for women. So while ejaculation, male ejaculation is allowed, female ejaculation is specifically banned, or would have been banned under these regulations. Face sitting, or in other words, forms of cunnilingus, were also to be banned. So we might like to think about the ways in which legislation, which is about protection of children, or some kind of, sometimes an attempt to reinscribe morals, is also about forms of sexual activity focused on, well, women aren't minorities, right? But, reinstituting forms of quite narrow understandings of what's appropriate sexuality and sexual practices which seem to privilege heterosexual men. So, of course, Brits have long talked about our kind of ways of being tolerant. We see ourselves as tolerant, and our newspapers would like to say that they are tolerant, though historians of sexuality have often tended to regard the press as another key partner in the containment and vilification of homosexuality. But others have suggested that maybe the history is more complicated and fraught than a simple history of intolerance. Instead, there's a kind of way in which, the stories will be decided on the basis of whether or not they'll make the newspaper some money, or indeed, I think here that it can be about who's currently political flavour at this point. And so actually, at the same time as we're seeing, lesbian and gay pride being represented, quite approvingly in some newspapers, there also was the demonization of movements in politics, which saw a shift of social analysis away from class to other categories. The political significance of sexual identity became ever more clear, but also at the same time, there's a kind of reinstitution of fear about alternative sexual activities and proclivities, which then had really disastrous results when HIV and AIDS hove into view. So I've got a short clip here.
So far, it's been confined to small groups, but it's so protect yourself. And read this leaflet when it arrives. If you ignore AIDS, it could be the death of you. So don't die of ignorance.
Okay, so the Tory government's response to a series of infections and problems moving throughout British culture was to double down on ideas of this as a gay plague and as a recognition that sex was dangerous. And in fact, that is the advertising campaign that they ran in 1987, in which, you know, the idea was, well, sex is a problem. Gay sex in particular is a problem. And people need to understand their own responsibilities. And there was a real sense of HIV/AIDS being the fault of gay men, that it was not a public health crisis. Instead, it was something that gay men had brought upon themselves. And, you know, we saw then turn to really quite retrograde kinds of legislation and political manoeuvring, which reached its apotheosis, its worst point, in the passing of Section 28 of the Local Government Act of 1988, which insisted that local authorities should not intentionally promote homosexuality or publish material with the intention of promoting homosexuality, and in particular must not identify homosexuality as equivalent to heterosexuality, and certainly that homosexual families should not be identified as approximating heterosexual family relationships. So what Thatcher called pretended family relationships was how she described gay couples who had children. And Section 28 really set off a scare.
The book Jenny Lives with Eric and Martin turned sex education from a subject that many parents preferred not to talk about to one where everyone had an opinion. It shocked many Conservatives and parents. Education Secretary Kenneth Baker apparently then turned away from his department's view that homosexuality shouldn't be avoided in classroom sex education to a stance critical of London authorities who promoted such ideas.
When Neil Kinnock boasts of his moral majority, let him remember that his majority consists of Mrs. Morell and all the other fads and fanatics of Brent, Haringey and Ealing.
That won him plenty of support at the party conference, and the government now intends to take a tougher stand against such authorities. The sort of confrontation seen last night in Haringey between parents and gay and lesbian rights activists who support the council's policy of promoting positive images of homosexuals in school classes has polarised opinions. Our cameras were barred from the meeting. The government now wants to put sex education into the hands of school governors instead of the local education authorities. Rebel right-wingers are pressing for more, for parents to take their children out of sex education classes altogether.
If they were able to withdraw their children...
I'm going to stop that there, actually, because I think I'm aware of time and I think I need to move on a bit. But I do want to say that that particular piece of legislation was only repealed in 2003. And I think it's, you know, it's important that we recognise how much its impact can still be felt across media culture today. There's certainly lots of talk of unnecessary promotion or normalisation of alternative non-heterosexualities. And, you know, there's a real sense of the way that family needs to be separated from ideas around alternative sexualities. However, what's also really interesting is the way that Thatcherite policies of the market and that the market should decide on everything has led, in fact, to a rise of commercialised sex, right? That actually we've seen a shift in the UK from relational to recreational models of sexual behaviour, and a way in which erotic life has been reconfigured as a pursuit of sexual intimacy, but also that this can be forms of sexual consumption as well as, sexual experiences and sexual practices, it's really important in British cultural life now to be seen to be having good sex, to understand your sex life as a source of happiness, a form of relaxation, a site of pleasure, expression of freedoms, and a means of, for some people, achieving spiritual wholeness, and as a leisure activity. And this is a short advert released during lockdown, actually, but I think, it sums up some of the more recent attitudes towards sex in the UK.
Listen up, Britain. Love Honey's at your service. Because who doesn't want better sex? So if it's your first sex toy tingle or your next bedroom buzz, we've got it all. It's time to say yes to more yes and turn up the turn on.
So, here there's a kind of idea of sex as fun and exciting, and that it's expansive and is on offer to everyone. There's no indication there of what sexuality necessarily each of those individuals in the ad might be. And this is quite a sea change. In that black and white photograph is Ann Summers' The Sex Shop chain, which started in the 1970s but catered to men and was a particularly seedy experience to go into, with really lackluster shelving and displays and things, and really not much stock on display, which then morphed into a woman-friendly store. In fact, women only at some level store in the 1990s, which bright lights, purple frontage, selling lots of lingerie and dressing up outfits, and kind of speaking more to eroticism than necessarily to sex. And Love Honey now is is constantly advertised on British TV in a way that's very interesting and kind of full of fun, and which kind of references many of the ways in which actually popular culture generally has embraced a kind of sexual consumerism. And certainly in the UK, I don't know whether Love Island is an element of Spanish popular culture, but here in the UK, Love Island amongst younger generation viewers is an incredibly popular programme based on a sexual attractiveness and actually having sex, hooking up. There is an element of romance to it, but it's also very much about sexual attraction. A thing that's exploited even more in the TV series Naked Attraction, in which contestants choose a potential mate on the basis of their body as it is incrementally exposed on TV. They get to choose from 6 men or 6 women, and then we see them both naked. And instead of being on the basis of what their character might be like, or what kinds of pet they have, or other kind of ways in which people have been matched to each other in the past, it's here on whether or not the pecs are big enough, the penis is big enough, bushes are shaved, or breasts are big enough. But alongside that, it's not just a free-for-all. I think we have to constantly keep coming back to this way in which this kind of light-hearted, fun approach to sex is all about, these are people who are free to engage in sexual relationships. There isn't any alcohol involved, or at least not too much in Love Island. That these are people who are freely choosing, and they're relatively good looking, and there's no perversion involved. But at the same time, on British TV, we see all kinds of documentary investigations, deep dives into, you know, the LBDSM lifestyles, which can also be incorporated or included in that kind of sexual consumerism, jolly idea of enjoying yourself and pleasure, but also tends as well to slip into the dark side, as happened and was exemplified in Porn Laid Bare, a 3-part series on BBC Three that took a deep dive into the dark heart of the Spanish porn industry, and started out very jolly and, oh, we're all having a good time and isn't this fun, and ended up, you know, in stories of sex trafficking and exploitation. And equally, you know, it's not just in terms of kind of institutions or industries that might be a problem. There's also a kind of prowling of the boundary as well of appropriate sexual behaviours on the part of individuals. And this Sun headline here in the middle of my slide is about, you know, the bad behaviour of a young woman in Magaluf and the scandal that ensued from that. What's interesting to me here, and I think I'd want you to point you back to my earlier slides, is the representation of this young woman as a girl, and about the ways in which the kind of boundary between having a really good time on your holiday and tipping over into really problematic behaviours is centred in the story on the working class roots of this young woman and her hedonistic pursuit of her pleasures, and that this is a problem. And, you know, this can be intensely politicised as well. I'm not going to dwell on this, but you can see here in the headlines, which saw the one of the government advisors on COVID and the necessity for lockdown being ousted from his job as a result of his tryst with another woman. And here, you know, the press went all out to indicate that this really was a problem, you know, that this was prowling, this was really a problematic set of behaviours on the part of this guy. And we've seen more stories recently. We've got recently the Daily Mirror broke its world exclusive that Boris Johnson, Prime Minister, has been or had been engaging in a marital affair he had denied previously, and that he did it in the marital home, in his family home. The story wasn't taken up actually by many other newspapers, which kind of indicates the ways in which scandal often is tied to political realities. And actually, quite surprisingly, The Sun didn't take it up for quite some time, but when it did, it sought to minimise it by using its, you know, cheeky chappy kind of headline. So Boris is a socks maniac, and other details in the story kind of highlight how he's just like one of the lads. How far this will continue as Boris is now appearing to be less and less the chosen one of our popular press, well, we'll see. But the sex story seems to be less important at this point. And of course, there's one other story which has yet to really ignite, and that is the story of Prince Andrew and the allegations of him with Jeffrey Epstein and what is his connection there. I think that, you know, in relation to these stories and the story of the Magaluf girl, we can see that the kinds of ways in which Britain articulates itself as a sexual environment, or as a culture engaging in sex, is quite, I don't want to use this term schizophrenic, but I can't think of another one at this point, but is not settled, and we have not yet lighted on where we see our culture going. And I must leave it there so that there might be time for questions. And thank you very much. I hope you've learned something there. I'd be really happy to take questions from people. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Clarissa, for this webinar on British issues concerning sex and sexuality. I'm going to stop the recording, so if there are any questions, people could be free to ask them.